The Star Wars arcade game is one of the best playing and looking tie-in arcade games of its time. The frantic pace of the events leading up to and during the Death Star assault naturally lends itself well to gameplay, and coupled with the incredible vector-based graphics, there's not much more you could ask for. Of course, it only seemed natural to make a port of the game for what was arguably the most popular system of the time, the Atari 2600. The porting process was bound to pose some issues for the developers, though. Those of you familiar with the 2600 in any capacity know how limited it is as far as graphics go, and vectors are a particularly fancy-looking style. Somehow, though, programmer Bob Smith was able to pull it off, even getting the graphics scaling to look pretty nice. And in 1984, people could finally experience the thrill of piloting an X-Wing fighter in the comfort of their home. In a bit of irony, a game that I would consider to be a far better representation of the Star Wars fight experience had already been released 2 years prior, and it doesn't even exist under the Star Wars name. It's a little game by Activision titled StarMaster. Why do I think it's better? Well, let's begin by talking about Star Wars. Graphically speaking, there is almost nothing in Star Wars that clearly demonstrates the license that's being used past the first section and prior to the very end where the Death Star explodes. In between, if you were to show the gameplay to someone without any context, it might appear to be some sort of strange Washington Monument simulator. I give Bob Smith credit. The Atari isn't easy to work with for starters, and attempting to produce 3D-looking graphics must have been some kind of nightmare, but nothing really looks defined enough to scream Star Wars. Even the X-Wing you're piloting doesn't resemble the movie one in any real capacity, if you think about it, having only 2 lasers, both of which are level with the cockpit. One graphical element I really do like, though, is the inclusion of some white dots in the background to make it feel more like space. Gameplay is where I find most of my problems with this game. For starters, the crosshairs feel incredibly awkward and imprecise to move. This could be partly due to the physical build of the Atari joysticks, but either way, every movement feels forced, especially when trying to move diagonally. It might seem like I'm nitpicking here, but really I'm not. I can't overstate how important control is to this sort of game, which is essentially an on-rail shooter. Precision is everything. The other big control problem comes in during the trench portion of the Death Star. Much like in the previous Washington Monument screen, you have to dodge objects and destroy projectiles, but here the challenge is incredibly unfair. To move vertically and dodge the force fields that populate the trench with any accuracy, one needs to force the crosshairs to either extreme extraordinarily quickly. Most of the time, it seems that you actually need to psychically predict the position of the next force field if you want to have enough time. I suppose that this game has one thing that's nice, and that's really distinctly Star Wars. It's the theme that plays when you first start it up. So what exactly does StarMaster do better than Star Wars? The answer? Practically everything. For starters, it must be said that graphically speaking, this game unsurprisingly isn't as ambitious as Star Wars, but that's ultimately to this game's benefit, I think. It doesn't try to pull off too much, so the devs were able to spend more time working on the gameplay, and with that being said, they were still able to pull off scaling objects. The ships in StarMaster seem more reminiscent of Star Trek, but I wouldn't really see them out of place in extra-canonical Star Wars material. Besides, it's really the gameplay that resembles Star Wars more than anything. The 2600 is a cool system visually for a few reasons. For one thing that the people at Activision really tuned into was its resemblance to a control panel of sorts, and they actually integrated that into the design of StarMaster. You see, the main portion of the game is just shooting oncoming enemies and dodging their fire, but to get to those enemies, you bring up your radar. Programmer Alan Miller was able to figure out how to use the black and white switch on the Atari as an input device, which controls the radar display. It might seem hard to imagine, but this ends up making the game super immersive, as if you're really sitting in the cockpit, setting course and going to light speed, which is represented perfectly by the faster movement of the stars on the screen. The combat in this game is also much more fluid than in Star Wars. The cursor, instead of moving all across the screen and slightly affecting your direction, is the focal point and the screen moves with it. It felt much easier to get my crosshairs where they needed to go when engaged in battles. The battles also have a much more Star Wars-like feel, giving off that dogfighting vibe the original trilogy always showcased so well, and that the Star Wars game really missed with its more on-rail style gameplay. Finally, another really amazing aspect of this game are the status effects you can acquire. If you get hit by an asteroid or enemy fire, there's a chance that you might lose your radar or laser controls, for example, and have to fly back to a base to get them repaired. This sort of thing happens all the time in Star Wars, and I think it's a really integral part when trying to emulate a Star Wars style space fight. This game really surprised me with how much depth it has for an Atari game, and it really deserves a look if you get the chance. In fact, I would actually say both of these games do. StarMaster, just a bit more. Thanks for watching.